In the early 1920s, at the height of America's most extravagant decade, the idea for Mar-a-Lago did not begin as a house. It began as a declaration. A statement written in stone, tile, and steel, meant to be seen from the ocean and felt long before it was understood. The nation was flush with post-war confidence. Money moved quickly, fortunes were minted overnight, and the architecture of the elite grew louder, heavier, and more symbolic. This was not an era of modest estates. It was an era of monuments disguised as residences. From the start, Mar-a-Lago was conceived to operate on a national scale, not a domestic one. Its ambition exceeded the human life it was meant to contain. Stand at the edge of Palm Beach as it was a century ago, still quiet, still exclusive, still forming its identity, and imagine the audacity required to claim 126 rooms on 20 acres of oceanfront land. This was not accidental excess. It was calculated. The project began in 1924 under the direction of Marjorie Merriweather Post, one of the wealthiest women in the world, whose serial empire produced cash flows that rivaled small governments. She did not want a winter retreat. She wanted permanence. A house that could host power, endure generations, and project legitimacy in a society where wealth alone was not enough. In old money America, architecture was a credential. The design language chosen was Mediterranean revival, a style already favored by America's coastal elite, but here pushed beyond convention. Spanish, Venetian, and Moorish influences were blended deliberately, signaling lineage, empire, and cultural inheritance. The effect was not subtle. Red clay roof tiles were imported from Spain, reportedly from centuries-old structures, each one irregular, aged, and costly to transport. The limestone came from Indiana, selected not for convenience but for prestige and durability. Inside, the materials grew more extravagant. Marble floors, hand-painted ceilings, gilded ironwork, and European antiques purchased and shipped across the Atlantic. This was not decoration. This was inventory. Assets embedded into architecture. Step past the showpiece rooms and the logic of the structure becomes clearer. Mar-a-Lago was engineered like a small city. Beneath the glamour ran systems. Electrical, plumbing, ventilation. Scaled for constant hosting, not private living. Servant corridors allowed staff to move unseen, maintaining the illusion of effortlessness. Kitchens were designed for banquets, not families. Storage rooms anticipated volume. This was a house built around labor, though the labor was never meant to be visible. The machinery of luxury was concealed behind walls thick enough to silence it. Construction costs quickly exceeded expectations. By the time the mansion was completed in 1927, estimates placed the expense at more than $7 million, over $100 million in today's terms, an extraordinary figure even among Gilded Age estates. Thousands of workers were involved across multiple years, including craftsmen imported for their specialized skills. Every delay added cost. Every refinement raised the stakes. Yet the money kept flowing. The logic of the decade insisted that growth was permanent and that grandeur justified itself. But architecture always answers to history, not ambition. Mar-a-Lago was completed just 2 years before the stock market crash of 1929. The timing matters. Houses like this were conceived in an economy that assumed endless expansion, yet they were born into collapse. The bill came due almost immediately. Maintenance alone required a permanent staff numbering in the dozens. Utilities, repairs, security, and taxes transformed the mansion into a financial organism that demanded constant feeding. Even for the ultra-wealthy, the cost of keeping it alive was relentless. Walk its corridors in your mind and the tension becomes palpable. The scale overwhelms the purpose. Rooms stretch wider than daily life requires. Ceilings rise higher than conversation needs. The house was built to impress a nation, but nations do not live in houses. People do. And people age, die, relocate, and reprioritize. The very features that made Mar-a-Lago extraordinary also made it impractical. It was too large to adapt, too specific to simplify, too expensive to ignore. Yet in its early years, the mansion succeeded in what it was designed to do. It attracted attention. It signaled dominance. It established its owner as a figure whose power did not require a title. Diplomats, industrialists, and cultural elites passed through its gates, absorbing the message encoded in its walls. This was a place where wealth crossed into authority, where architecture functioned as social infrastructure. Power without a crown. Behind the facade, however, the questions were already forming. Who really paid for this? Not just in dollars, but in labor, logistics, and opportunity cost. Every imported tile carried a supply chain. Every servant corridor implied an unseen workforce. Every square foot demanded upkeep long after the applause faded. Mar-a-Lago was not simply a home. It was a system, one that could only survive as long as money and attention continued to flow. By the end of the 1920s, the mansion stood complete, magnificent, and ominously out of step with the country around it. America was changing. The mood had shifted. Extravagance was no longer celebrated, it was scrutinized. Houses like this, once symbols of national confidence, began to feel like relics of excess. Mar-a-Lago had been built to endure, but endurance has a cost, and the house would soon begin to reveal just how high that price could be. The woman behind Mar-a-Lago was not a decorative socialite drifting through inherited privilege. She was a systems thinker, a corporate heir who understood leverage, visibility, and control long before those words entered popular vocabulary. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born into wealth, but she multiplied it. By the time construction on Mar-a-Lago began in 1924, she was already one of the richest individuals in the United States, presiding over the Postum Cereal Company, later General Foods, at a scale that produced industrial-level cash flow. This mattered. The mansion was not funded by sentiment or nostalgia. It was financed by a modern corporate engine, one that converted packaged food into political access, social authority, and architectural permanence. Stand behind the facade for a moment and the motive sharpens. Post was acutely aware that wealth alone did not grant legitimacy in America's old social hierarchies. The East Coast elite, particularly in places like Palm Beach, operated on lineage, exclusivity, and architecture as proof. A grand house was not a lifestyle choice, it was an entry credential. Mar-a-Lago was conceived as her passport into a world that still quietly resisted self-made power, especially when held by a woman. The scale was intentional. Excess was the argument. Her personal life intersected with global power in ways that shaped the mansion's early years. Through her marriage to Joseph E. Davies, a prominent lawyer and diplomat, Post gained direct proximity to Washington's highest circles. Davies would later serve as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union during one of the most volatile periods of the 20th century. This was not a social coincidence. It was strategic adjacency. Mar-a-Lago became a physical extension of that influence, designed to host politicians, foreign dignitaries, industrial leaders, and cultural gatekeepers under one roof. A house that could entertain at scale became a tool. Architecture as diplomacy. Step into the logic of her ambition and the contradictions appear. Post cultivated an image of elegance, generosity, and civic-mindedness, yet the structure she built demanded absolute control. Staff were numerous and hierarchically organized, with clear divisions between visible service and unseen labor. House managers, cooks, groundskeepers, and maintenance crews operated on strict routines, maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury. The machinery of luxury ran constantly, even when guests were absent. This was not a seasonal retreat. It was an institution that required discipline, silence, and expenditure. Quiet controversy followed her long before headlines ever did. In elite circles, there was unease about the scale of her spending and the conspicuousness of her displays. During the 1920s, wealth was celebrated publicly but privately policed. Old families tolerated grandeur only when it appeared inherited. Post's fortune was modern, corporate, and visibly expanding. Mar-a-Lago made that expansion impossible to ignore. It challenged social boundaries by existing so boldly. The house did not ask permission. It announced arrival. Behind closed doors, Post's motives were layered. She spoke publicly about legacy and national purpose, yet privately understood that architecture could outlive reputation. She was deeply conscious of mortality, remarriage, and the fragility of social standing. Mar-a-Lago was her insurance policy against erasure, a permanent object in a transient world, a house that could not be dismissed as a phase or indulgence. In this sense, it was less a home than a monument built in advance of history's judgment. The economic context sharpened the tension. Construction and early occupancy occurred just before the Great Depression, a moment when extreme wealth would soon be morally scrutinized. While millions faced unemployment and displacement, estates like Mar-a-Lago stood as reminders of imbalance. Post was not blind to this shift. She increased charitable giving, supported cultural institutions, and positioned herself as a benefactor. Yet the mansion remained silent, immovable. Its upkeep alone contradicted any narrative of restraint. The cost of keeping it alive never disappeared. It merely receded from view. Walk through the social choreography of its early years and another pattern emerges. Invitations were selective. Access was curated. Mar-a-Lago was not merely hosting society, it was shaping it. Who was invited signaled who mattered. Who was excluded mattered just as much. Power without a crown often operates this way, through doors opened and doors left closed. The house amplified Post's influence by turning private wealth into a public stage. There were whispers, too, about control within her personal relationships. Marriages ended. Alliances shifted. The house remained constant. Some contemporaries noted that Mar-a-Lago seemed to outlast the people around it, absorbing transitions without changing its purpose. In this sense, the mansion became a stabilizing force for Post herself, anchoring her identity as roles shifted from wife to divorcee to diplomat spouse to independent magnate. Architecture as emotional infrastructure. What they don't show in glossy photographs is the weight of maintaining such authority. Taxes rose. Labor costs increased. Palm Beach itself evolved, bringing zoning pressures and civic scrutiny. Post's wealth could absorb these pressures, but the system demanded constant attention. A house of this scale never sleeps. It consumes resources daily regardless of personal circumstance. The bill comes due whether guests arrive or not. Behind the public rooms of Mar-a-Lago, the architecture begins to speak a different language. Not one of beauty but of management, control, Separation. What appears, at first glance, to be a lavish Mediterranean fantasy was engineered with an entirely different priority beneath the surface. This was not a house designed for comfort or ease. It was a structure designed to function, to regulate people, and to protect authority from intrusion. The glamour was the outer skin. The real architecture lived behind the facade. Stand in the central hall and notice how movement is guided without being obvious. Sight lines are deliberate. Doorways align to frame spectacle, while other passages slip quietly out of view. The building's internal circulation was carefully planned to divide social worlds. Guests followed one route. Staff followed another. These paths rarely crossed, and when they did, it was by design. Hidden corridors ran parallel to public rooms, allowing servants to deliver food, remove debris, and reset spaces without ever interrupting conversation. This was not hospitality. It was choreography. Step past the showpiece rooms and the mansion reveals itself as a machine. Service staircases were narrow and steep, optimized for speed rather than comfort. Utility doors blended seamlessly into paneled walls, disguised as decorative elements. Even sound was engineered. Thick masonry walls and layered ceilings dampened noise, ensuring that the labor sustaining the house remained invisible. What they don't show in photographs is how much effort went into hiding effort itself. The imported European elements were not simply aesthetic trophies. They were signals. Tiles salvaged from Spanish estates, stonework inspired by Venetian palazzos, and wrought iron echoing Moorish patterns were embedded to imply age, lineage, and continuity. These materials were chosen not just for beauty, but for narrative. They suggested a past that did not belong to the building, borrowing centuries of cultural authority and installing it instantly on American soil. Architecture here was performing legitimacy. But beneath these materials were structural decisions that reinforced exclusivity. Rooms were oversized not for comfort but for hierarchy. Large spaces diminish individuals while elevating hosts. Ceilings rose high enough to cool Florida heat naturally, reducing reliance on mechanical systems in the early years, but also amplifying presence. When someone stood at the center of a room, they commanded it. This was intentional. Power without a crown requires staging. Behind locked doors were rooms never meant for guests. Storage chambers held inventory on a scale more common to institutions than homes. Linen closets functioned like warehouses. Kitchens were divided into zones: preparation, cooking, plating, staffed by specialized workers whose roles were narrowly defined. This division of labor reduced friction and increased output. The house did not adapt to people. People adapted to the house. Hidden rooms also served another purpose: discretion. Secure spaces allowed private meetings away from the main house, shielded from casual observation. Thick doors, limited windows, and controlled access points ensured that certain conversations left no witnesses. In an era when influence traveled through personal relationships, architecture provided insulation. A place to speak freely, to negotiate, to decide. Secrecy was not an accident of design. It was a requirement. Even the layout of the estate reinforced separation. The mansion stretched from ocean to lake, creating a private axis of control across Palm Beach. Service buildings, staff housing, and maintenance areas were positioned out of sight, often at significant distance from guest areas. This physical removal reinforced social distance. The unseen hands that kept the property running remained just that, unseen. Walk along the exterior walls and the thickness becomes apparent. These were not decorative shells. They were load-bearing barriers, built to endure storms, humidity, and time. But they also served to isolate. Light entered selectively. Views were framed, not open. The house revealed what it wanted you to see and concealed the rest. A legacy with a price often learns how to protect itself. The cost of these architectural choices was immense. Imported materials required transatlantic logistics, specialized labor, and extended timelines. Maintenance demands multiplied. Every hidden corridor needed cleaning. Every concealed door needed repair. The machinery of luxury never rests, and Mar-a-Lago's design ensured that upkeep was constant. The bill comes due daily, not annually. Yet these decisions achieved their goal. The house operated smoothly, efficiently, and hierarchically. Guests experienced ease. Staff experienced discipline. Authority flowed through space itself. This is the unseen power of architecture, not what it displays but what it enforces. A house that became a system can outlast its original purpose because it is built to manage change. Behind the facade, Mar-a-Lago was never simply a mansion. It was an infrastructure of influence, designed to host power, conceal labor, and regulate access. Every hidden corridor asked the same question in stone and steel. Who belongs where? Who moves freely? Who remains invisible? When the applause faded and the social calendar thinned, Mar-a-Lago confronted a reality its builders never designed for. Grandeur does not age gracefully without constant funding, and by the mid-20th century the mansion's scale had turned from asset to liability. What once symbolized limitless ambition now revealed its true nature. A house so large, so specific, and so expensive that even powerful institutions hesitated to claim it. The problem was not beauty. It was sustainability. The bill had come due. Stand on the grounds as they were after Marjorie Merriweather Post's death in 1973, and the silence feels different. This was no longer a lively seat of hosting and movement. It was an estate awaiting a decision. Post had envisioned the mansion as a future presidential retreat, a winter White House that would serve the nation itself. In theory, it was a patriotic gesture. In practice, it was an architectural miscalculation. When ownership transferred to the federal government, the machinery of luxury collided with bureaucratic reality. The numbers alone were daunting. Annual maintenance costs were estimated in the millions, even before accounting for security, staffing, restoration, and modernization. The house required a full workforce simply to remain functional. Groundskeepers, engineers, custodial staff, administrators, and security personnel. Utilities were vast. Roof repairs were constant. Salt air accelerated decay. Florida's climate punished every surface. What they don't show in legacy narratives is how quickly a grand estate becomes a drain when no private fortune stands behind it. Public institutions operate on scrutiny and justification. Every dollar must be defended. Mar-a-Lago offered no such defense. It was too far from Washington to serve practical governance needs. Its layout, designed for private hosting rather than public administration, resisted conversion. Retrofitting the building for modern government use would have required massive alterations, erasing much of what made it architecturally significant in the first place. Preservation and functionality were in conflict, and neither could win without immense cost. Step past the locked doors of those years and you find rooms unused, systems idle, and materials quietly deteriorating. Deferred maintenance is a slow violence. Leaks go unrepaired. Wood swells. Iron corrodes. Once a house like this loses momentum, recovery becomes exponentially more expensive. The cost of keeping it alive increases precisely when resources withdraw. This is how monuments slip into limbo, not through disaster but through hesitation. Controversy deepened the problem. The mansion's association with extreme wealth made it politically awkward to justify public funding. At a time when infrastructure, housing, and social programs competed for attention, preserving a palatial estate carried reputational risk. Critics questioned why taxpayers should underwrite a symbol of elite excess. Supporters argued for its historical and architectural value. The debate stalled action. Inaction did the rest. Behind the facade, Mar-a-Lago revealed its inflexibility. It could not shrink. It could not simplify. Every attempt to repurpose it ran into the same wall. Scale. The very features that once impressed a nation now repelled caretakers. This was not a museum-ready structure with defined circulation and controlled environments. It was a living system that demanded constant human input. A house that became a machine cannot simply be switched off. Years passed in uncertainty. Proposals surfaced, dissolved, resurfaced. Some suggested selling it outright. Others floated partial preservation. None resolved the core issue. Ownership without a viable operating model is a slow erosion of value. The mansion sat in a kind of architectural purgatory, too important to demolish, too costly to maintain, too controversial to embrace fully. Walk the perimeter in those years and you would have sensed tension rather than triumph. Palm Beach evolved around it, zoning laws tightened, civic expectations shifted. The estate no longer fit cleanly into its surroundings. It was oversized for its era, misaligned with public sentiment, and stranded between identities. A private palace without a patron. A public asset without a mandate. This period exposed a truth rarely acknowledged in architectural history. Buildings do not fail because they are poorly designed. They fail because their operating assumptions collapse. Mar-a-Lago assumed permanent wealth, permanent relevance, permanent justification. When those assumptions weakened, the structure had no fallback. The unseen hands that once sustained it withdrew and the system stalled. The mansion's neglect was not dramatic. No single moment marked its fall. Instead there was drift. Rooms darkened. Maintenance schedules stretched. Decisions postponed. Each year of uncertainty compounded the next. Preservation experts understand this pattern well. Delay is the most expensive choice a caretaker can make. Yet even in this suspended state, the house retained its presence. It loomed. It reminded. It provoked debate simply by existing. A legacy with a price does not disappear quietly. It waits. It pressures. It demands resolution from whoever stands next in its path. Mar-a-Lago's failed destiny during these years was not about rejection alone. It was about mismatch. A house built for private power could not easily become a public one. The architecture resisted compromise, and the institution resisted obligation. Between them lay years of neglect and unresolved purpose. When Mar-a-Lago changed hands in the mid-1980s, it did not do so quietly or cleanly. The transaction itself reflected the mansion's unresolved identity. This was not a simple sale of real estate. It was a transfer of a burden, an opportunity, and a dormant symbol waiting to be reactivated. By then, years of uncertainty had stripped the house of momentum. Deferred maintenance lingered in the walls. Systems were outdated. The estate's scale still demanded institutional-level funding, but no institution remained willing to provide it. Into that vacuum stepped a private buyer who did not see the house as a relic to be preserved, but as an instrument to be repurposed. The shift was not cosmetic. It was conceptual. The mansion's survival depended on altering how it functioned economically and socially. As a private residence, Mar-a-Lago had always been expensive. As a public asset, it had been untenable. The solution was to turn exclusivity itself into a revenue model. By converting the estate into a private club, the cost of keeping it alive could be distributed across a membership base rather than borne by a single owner or the public. This was the pivotal transformation. Architecture adapted not through demolition or downsizing, but through financial reengineering. Stand at the gates during this transition and the change becomes apparent. Access, once limited by invitation, was now regulated by membership. The mansion's internal logic, its hidden corridors, service zones, and vast entertaining spaces, suddenly made sense again. What had been excessive for one family became efficient for hundreds. The house had always been built to host at scale. Now scale paid for itself. The conversion required significant logistical adjustments. Portions of the estate were reclassified. Kitchens were upgraded to commercial standards. Staff roles multiplied and specialized. Security protocols tightened. Insurance costs rose. Zoning battles followed, as Palm Beach authorities resisted the idea of a private club operating within a residential enclave. Legal agreements restricted how often members could stay overnight and how the property could be used. These constraints shaped behavior, but they also preserved the mansion's mystique. Scarcity maintained value. Behind the facade, the machinery of luxury restarted. Revenues flowed in the form of initiation fees, annual dues, and event hosting. Maintenance schedules returned. Roofs were repaired. Interiors stabilized. What preservationists could not secure through public funding was achieved through privatized exclusivity. The house did not become democratic. It became sustainable. Over time, the estate's function expanded beyond leisure. The club became a gathering point for donors, influencers, and power brokers. Architecture again served as infrastructure. Dining rooms became meeting rooms. Terraces became stages. The house's history as a place of hosting political and social elites resurfaced, now amplified by media coverage and global attention. A building designed to project authority found itself doing so again, this time under constant observation. Step past the showpiece rooms during this era and notice how little the core architecture needed to change. The house had always been prepared for hierarchy, surveillance, and control of movement. Those qualities now align seamlessly with its new role. Privacy and visibility coexisted uneasily, exactly as before. The difference was scale of exposure. What once operated discreetly now operated in public view. As global events unfolded, Mar-a-Lago's identity hardened. It was no longer merely a club or an estate. It became a symbol, invoked, debated, and photographed endlessly. Its architecture absorbed meaning it had not originally been designed to carry. Balconies became backdrops. Ballrooms became news footage. The house functioned as both setting and signal, a physical shorthand for power without a crown. This transformation came with costs beyond maintenance. Scrutiny intensified. Security requirements expanded dramatically, bringing federal involvement back into a property that had once been rejected as impractical. Streets closed. Airspace restrictions appeared. The mansion's operating complexity increased, but so did its relevance. The cost of keeping it alive rose again, now justified not by preservation or leisure, but by symbolism. Behind the facade, the tension remained unresolved. A private property had become a public focal point. The unseen hands multiplied: staff, security, planners, technicians, each contributing to a system that operated daily under pressure. The house did not retreat from history. It positioned itself at the center of it. Mar-a-Lago's transformation was not an accident of personality or politics. It was an architectural inevitability. Buildings of this scale do not disappear easily. When abandoned, they decay. When repurposed, they amplify whatever function replaces the original. Here, exclusivity evolved into influence. Hosting evolved into signaling. A private palace became a power symbol because its bones had always supported that role. The mansion survived not by softening its excess, but by monetizing it. By turning access into currency, it aligned its survival with demand. This was not preservation in the traditional sense. It was adaptation through control. A legacy with a price continues only if someone is willing to pay it. Walk its halls today and the layers are visible if you know where to look. The original ambition. The period of neglect. Behind the facade of Mar-a-Lago, controversy did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Layer by layer, dispute by dispute, until the mansion itself became a legal and ethical fault line. What had once been a private estate, then a private club, now occupied a gray zone where personal ownership collided with public consequence. The architecture had not changed, but the meaning of its walls had. And meaning, once politicized, attracts pressure. The first fractures appeared in zoning. Palm Beach was designed to protect residential quiet, not to host an estate operating at institutional scale. The mansion's conversion into a club required negotiated exemptions, limits on overnight stays, caps on membership use, restrictions on expansion. These agreements were not symbolic. They were legal guardrails meant to contain impact. Every exception carved into the code acknowledged a problem. This property was no longer behaving like a house. It was functioning as an enterprise inside a neighborhood built to resist exactly that. Stand at the perimeter during peak activity and the tension becomes visible. Traffic patterns shift. Security checkpoints appear. Streets close with little notice. Local infrastructure absorbs strain it was never designed to handle. Palm Beach residents did not consent to hosting a quasi-public power hub, yet found themselves living beside one. Lawsuits followed. Complaints accumulated. The house's presence forced the town to continually renegotiate where private rights ended and communal burden began. Security transformed the estate more dramatically than any renovation ever could. Once global attention focused on the mansion, its grounds required protection at a federal scale. Law enforcement coordination, airspace restrictions, maritime patrols, surveillance infrastructure, all imposed on a privately owned property. This blurred an essential boundary. Taxpayer-funded security now surrounded a private club. The question emerged quietly, then loudly: who really paid for this? Behind the scenes, the logistics were staggering. Security perimeters disrupted daily life. Local budgets stretched to accommodate federal operations. Emergency services trained for scenarios once unthinkable in a seaside town. The machinery of luxury now included the machinery of the state. What had been marketed as private exclusivity depended increasingly on public resources to function safely. Legal scrutiny intensified. Agreements governing the property's use were revisited repeatedly, with accusations of overreach and violation. Critics argued that the estate was exceeding its permitted function. Defenders argued that its status justified flexibility. Courts became arbiters of architecture's role in civic life. Rarely does a building force such questions so persistently. Ethical concerns ran parallel. The use of a private property as a venue for political engagement raised alarms about access, influence, and fairness. Membership fees, invitations, proximity, these became currencies. Architecture again acted as gatekeeper. Who entered mattered. Who waited outside mattered more. Power without a crown often prefers informal settings, and Mar-a-Lago provided precisely that, wrapped in luxury and deniability. Step past the showpiece rooms during moments of controversy and the dissonance sharpens. Gold finishes gleam while legal filings circulate. Palm trees sway as protests gather beyond gates. The house absorbs contradiction effortlessly. It has done so since its inception. Yet now the stakes are higher. Decisions made within its walls ripple outward, affecting communities far beyond Palm Beach. Privacy itself became contested terrain. Journalists, investigators, and observers fixated on the estate, challenging the assumption that private ownership guarantees private activity. Surveillance cameras multiplied. Sightlines reversed. The watchers were now being watched. The mansion's thick walls, once symbols of insulation, proved permeable to scrutiny in the modern era. Behind the facade, the question of precedent loomed. If a private property could operate with such public consequence, what did that mean for the future of civic boundaries? Mar-a-Lago did not invent this tension, but it crystallized it. The mansion became a case study in how architecture can outgrow the legal frameworks meant to contain it. Financial questions followed closely. Who funded what? Local taxpayers questioned why municipal services were strained. Federal agencies justified expenditures as necessary. The accounting blurred. Costs dispersed across budgets, agencies, and jurisdictions. The bill came due in pieces, paid incrementally, often invisibly. This diffusion of responsibility made accountability difficult, which only deepened mistrust. The estate's symbolic weight intensified every conflict. Ordinary zoning disputes became national news. Routine security measures became political flashpoints. The house amplified everything that touched it. Architecture, when scaled beyond normal life, does this. It magnifies consequence. Walk its grounds today and you feel the pressure embedded in the air. Not danger but scrutiny. The sense that every action here is recorded, interpreted, argued over. The mansion no longer belongs solely to its owner, yet it is not owned by the public either. It exists in between, sustained by legal exceptions and contested legitimacy. What they don't show in glossy images is how exhausting this is for a structure. Not physically but institutionally. Constant litigation. Constant negotiation. Constant attention. By the time Mar-a-Lago entered the global spotlight, its architecture had already learned how to host power. What changed was not the building's function, but its audience. The mansion had always been a stage, designed for arrival, procession, and display, but now the audience was no longer limited to invited guests inside the gates. Cameras arrived. Satellites hovered. The house began performing for the world. Stand at the entrance during a high-profile visit and the choreography becomes unmistakable. Motorcades align along the curved drive. Security layers stack outward, concentric rings of control extending into public streets. The architecture frames every movement. Porticos become thresholds of authority. Staircases become moments of pause, engineered for visibility. This is not accidental. The building's original designers understood spectacle, even if they could not have predicted 24-hour news cycles. Inside, rooms once intended for elite social hosting became meeting spaces where headlines were made before conversations ended. Dining tables doubled as negotiating platforms. Terraces functioned as diplomatic theaters. The house absorbed the rituals of modern power effortlessly because it had been built for hierarchy from the beginning. Architecture that understands control adapts quickly when control is demanded of it. Media attention altered the mansion's physics. Space compressed. Distance disappeared. A comment made inside traveled instantly across borders. The walls no longer contained meaning, they projected it. Behind the facade, staff adapted to an entirely new operational reality. Schedules tightened. Movement was monitored. Logistics became relentless. Every event required coordination between private staff and public agencies, between hospitality and security, between discretion and exposure. The machinery of luxury now ran alongside the machinery of media. Step past the showpiece rooms during these moments and the unseen hands multiply. Technicians manage communications. Security teams map sight lines. Legal advisors hover nearby. The house hums with preparation long before any guest arrives. Power does not simply appear. It is staged, supported, and maintained through systems embedded deep within the architecture. Conflict followed visibility. Protesters gathered beyond gates. Supporters answered. The mansion's perimeter became a line of confrontation. Palm Beach, once a backdrop of quiet wealth, turned into a site of recurring tension. Streets closed. Airspace restricted. Waterways monitored. A private estate now shaped public space far beyond its boundaries. Architecture extended its influence outward, redrawing the map of daily life. Global leaders passing through the mansion reinforced its symbolic weight. Photographs circulated. Statements echoed. The building's image traveled farther than its physical reach. Mar-a-Lago became shorthand, a visual cue signaling authority, controversy, alignment, or opposition depending on who viewed it. The house no longer needed explanation. Its silhouette carried meaning. Behind the facade, the costs escalated. Security expenditures surged. Staffing expanded. Maintenance schedules tightened to accommodate constant use under scrutiny. The cost of keeping it alive rose not because the building aged, but because its role intensified. A house that becomes a global stage must meet standards far beyond residential life. The bill comes due in personnel hours, infrastructure upgrades, and risk management. Privacy eroded. Helicopters circled. Cameras probed. The architecture's original promise of insulation proved limited in the face of modern surveillance. Thick walls could not block attention. Hidden corridors no longer guaranteed anonymity. The house adapted by formalizing access, tightening protocols, and accepting that discretion now operated differently. Power without a crown rarely hides completely. Walk through the estate during moments of peak attention and the contrast is stark. Ornate interiors coexist with hardened security. Gilded spaces echo with logistical commands. Luxury persists, but it is under pressure. What they don't show is how exhausting this is for a structure, to host constant significance without respite. Buildings feel this through accelerated use, through the relentless demand to perform. The mansion's role in conflict extended beyond physical presence. It became a focal point in debates about legitimacy, influence, and governance. Its architecture framed arguments simply by existing. Critics pointed to it as excess. Supporters framed it as success. The building absorbed projection from every side, becoming a mirror rather than a message. Media cycles fed this dynamic. Each visit, each event, each confrontation layered new meaning onto old stone. The house became a palimpsest of modern power struggles, its original narrative overwritten repeatedly without ever being erased. Architecture is patient this way. It allows history to accumulate. Behind the facade, the mansion's endurance revealed an uncomfortable truth. Buildings designed for dominance rarely fade quietly. They attract attention because they were built to. Mar-a-Lago's evolution into a global stage was not a deviation from its origins. It was an amplification. The scale, the isolation, the hierarchy, all made it inevitable. As global attention intensified, so did moral tension. Who benefits from this visibility? Who bears the cost? Local communities adjusted. Public resources engaged. Private ownership blurred into public consequence. The house did not resolve these questions. It embodied them. Today, Mar-a-Lago stands intact, occupied, maintained, and unmistakably alive, but its meaning is fractured. The mansion has outlived its creator, its original purpose, and multiple attempts to define it cleanly. What remains is not consensus but division. The architecture no longer asks to be admired. It demands to be interpreted. Stand at the edge of the property now and the contradiction is immediate. The structure is meticulously preserved, its roofs repaired, its interiors refreshed, its systems operational. This is not a ruin. It is not abandoned. And yet it is no longer simply a house. Its physical survival masks a deeper instability, a nation unable to agree on what the building represents or what it should be allowed to do. Behind the facade, Mar-a-Lago carries two simultaneous identities. To some, it is proof of endurance, an example of how private capital can preserve what public institutions could not. A house saved from decay through adaptation. To others, it is a symbol of imbalance, where wealth and influence bend systems meant to be neutral. The same walls support both readings without contradiction. Architecture is indifferent to ideology. It absorbs it. Walk through the estate in your mind and notice how little has changed structurally since the 1920s. The grand halls remain hierarchical. The circulation still separates the visible from the unseen. The hidden corridors still function. This continuity matters. The building's original logic, control, exclusivity, insulation, was never dismantled. It was validated by survival. A house that becomes a machine does not forget how it works. The mansion's legacy is inseparable from cost. Not just financial but civic. Maintaining a structure of this scale in the modern era requires ongoing negotiation with public systems. Security, zoning, infrastructure, emergency services. These costs are rarely itemized in public memory, but they persist quietly, paid for in time, labor, and diverted resources. What they don't show is how permanence is subsidized. Mar-a-Lago reflects a broader American tension, the uneasy relationship between private wealth and public consequence. The house is privately owned, yet its impact spills outward continuously. Roads close. Airspace tightens. Media attention surges. The boundary between private life and public effect dissolves. Architecture becomes policy by other means. Behind the facade, the question of legitimacy never settles. Is the mansion a cultural artifact deserving protection regardless of politics? Or is it an active participant in contemporary power struggles, impossible to separate from them? Preservation usually relies on distance. Mar-a-Lago offers none. It exists in the present tense. The building's polarizing nature is not accidental. It is the result of layered decisions spanning a century, choices about scale, location, adaptation, and control. Each era added meaning without removing the previous one. Wealth became influence. Influence became visibility. Visibility became conflict. The structure held all of it. Stand in the hall where generations of guests once gathered and consider how architecture records human ambition. The walls remember confidence, fear, neglect, revival. They do not choose sides. They endure. And endurance itself can be provocative in a society that expects symbols to fade when values shift. Mar-a-Lago divides because it refuses to resolve. It is neither relic nor purely modern instrument. It is both. A legacy with a price continues to demand payment long after the original bill was written. That payment comes in attention, argument, and unease. The mansion's continued operation proves something fundamental about American architecture. Buildings designed to concentrate power rarely become neutral with age. They continue to attract energy, supportive or hostile, because they were built to hold it. The scale ensures relevance. The isolation amplifies it. The history deepens it. Behind the facade, the unseen hands remain at work. Staff maintain systems. Security monitors thresholds. Administrators manage flow. The house functions daily, quietly enforcing the same spatial rules it always has. Guests move where permitted. Others remain outside. Architecture does not debate. It directs. As a cultural object, Mar-a-Lago resists simplification. Attempts to frame it as merely beautiful or merely controversial fail because the building contains both truths simultaneously. This is why it endures in public imagination. It is not settled history. It is active architecture. Walk away from the gates and the questions follow. Can a house ever be separated from the power it enables? Can preservation exist without endorsement? At what point does architecture stop reflecting society and begin shaping it? Mar-a-Lago offers no answers. It stands instead as evidence. Evidence that buildings outlast intentions. That ambition leaves marks deeper than ideology. That stone and steel can carry moral weight long after their builders are gone. In the end, the mansion's legacy is not about agreement. It is about exposure. Exposure of how wealth becomes structure, how structure becomes influence, and how influence reshapes the landscape around it. Behind the facade, America sees itself, unevenly, uncomfortably, and without resolution. The house remains. The division remains. Architecture waits. Which house should we investigate next?